Welcome to Reading the Gospels Together, and today we're in John chapter 6, and we find ourselves in familiar territory with the feeding of the 5,000, a miracle also recorded in the other Gospels. In fact, this is the first time that John repeats one of the miracles which the others record. Much of what John tries to do in his Gospel is to supplement what was lacking in the others, so I wonder why he records this one. Well, we'll find out. John begins by telling us that Jesus is back in Galilee sometime later. His reputation as a healing and miracle worker has drawn significant crowds. And then there's an important line, easy to overlook. The Jewish Passover feast was near. We're to understand this miracle in the light of Passover, and that becomes important in what's going to come. In fact, John often places the miracles of Jesus very carefully within the context of various feasts that we can understand Jesus in the context of. So let's pay attention to this one. Well, first of all, notice that Philip and Andrew are the disciples Jesus speaks with about feeding the crowd. Not coincidentally, they're also the first two disciples named in the Gospel of John back in chapter 1. Philip, remember, is a local and well-known figure in the area John is writing his Gospel. John's audience would be very interested to hear about every possible interaction which Philip has with Jesus. And Andrew is once again described as Simon Peter's brother. Peter's fame among the communities of faith was already very significant in the early days. He was obviously more well known than Andrew, who's always given that context of being Peter's brother. Now, as in the synoptic retellings, there are 5 small loaves and 2 small fish. Here they're provided by a generous small boy. Enough food there for one single humble family meal. But in Jesus' hands, it proves to be enough. He gives thanks to God for the food. Notice that Jesus doesn't bless the food. He gives thanks to God for it. And everyone in the crowd, we are told, eats as much as they want. In fact, there are 12 baskets of leftovers, perhaps symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel, that the sustenance which Jesus offers is enough for all the people to be satisfied. Now, you can get quite a lesson from Jesus saying, let nothing be wasted. The extravagance of God does not imply a reckless wastefulness. That is true for what God provides with us as well. We have not been blessed in order to be wasteful, but so that others will be blessed out of our abundance. The whole miracle is an opportunity for me to make a plug in support of the Canadian Food Grains Bank. The pandemic has made their work all the more vital. Why not, as a sign of thanksgiving to God and as a blessing out of your abundance, make a donation to them now? You can do so through our office or website, and like the boy with 5 small loaves and 2 small fish, your generosity combined with God's blessing will make a difference to many people, oftentimes a life-altering, life-saving difference. Well, back to our story, although that plug for the Canadian Food Grains Bank is not separate from it. The miracle, not surprisingly, produces a reaction among the people. Here is Passover right around the corner, as we've been told, the celebration of God's deliverance from the Egyptians. And now look, here's a prophet sent by God who provides food for all the people, just like Moses did in the desert, or perhaps like Elijah, for whom a place is set at every Passover in expectation of his return. God's deliverer is here. And we are told in anticipation that the people intended to make him king by force, Jesus withdrew into the hills by himself. It was not yet time. And Jesus' kingship, as we know, would be marked by a very different event than this. Which leads into another familiar story, but no less exciting for all that. The disciples, without Jesus, decide to sail back to Capernaum across the lake, meaning that implies they were on the east side, perhaps towards the southern end of the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum is on the northwest end. A storm had brewed, and now in the dark of night, it caught the disciples in deep water, about halfway across the lake. To their terror, they see Jesus walking towards them on the water. Jesus identifies himself, and only then, we read, were they willing to take him into the boat. They weren't willing to take a ghost into the boat, but Jesus, yes. Now, in a curious deviation from the other Gospels, rather than the storm being immediately calmed, we are instead told that immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Now, is the story implying that the dark and the storm had driven the disciples off course, disorienting them, and only by recognizing Jesus and allowing him aboard were they able to reach their destination? Remember that in John, darkness always means ignorance and lostness. Jesus has not only, in the story of the boat and the storm, provided salvation, but direction. With Jesus on board, they've arrived safely home. Now, John concludes the story with a detail about the crowd that had been left behind. They'd remained on the other side of the lake to once again gain an audience with Jesus. By then, word of the miracle had spread around the lake, and the boats from the capital city on the lake, Tiberias, showed up to see what was going on. Realizing that Jesus and the disciples had left, the crowd, on boat and foot, returned to Jesus' home base all the way back in Capernaum. Now, a lesson perhaps that we should not spare any effort to be in the presence of Jesus, as these people realized. Nowadays, under COVID protocols, we have to make a special effort to attend worship, registering in advance, being seated where we can, wearing a mask to sing. I think the folks in this story would consider that a small price to pay in order to be in the presence of Jesus for worship. Now, I'm also glad that we've been able to expand our facility use in order to safely accommodate up to about 180 people. And this in a facility which will hold over 750, but with the 6-foot separations and so on, that's the best we can do. I'm glad, too, that our services of worship are available online for those either at a distance or those who feel themselves more vulnerable to infection and are avoiding gatherings. The main thing is that we worship. And through our worship, whether it is here or online, we keep our lives open to the work of God in and through us. So, let's read just a bit further today by way of setting up part 2 of chapter 6. The crowd from the other side of the lake, as we read, has caught up to Jesus, and Jesus challenges them. He says, "Very truly, I tell you, you're looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." Which is to say, you're here not because of who I am, but because of what you can get out of me. Now, those are hard words. It strikes to the very core of our motivation to worship. Are we worshiping God for who God is, or for what we can get out of God? Now, there are so-called prosperity preachers who focus their message on God making you rich and successful, on worshiping God in order to be financially blessed. Now, while following Jesus carries the assurance of great spiritual blessing, and while a disciplined spiritual life has side effects in all the other aspects of our existence, remember that Jesus himself was without money or possessions, and he called those who followed him to give rather than to accumulate. The pattern of those in the early church was to share their possessions so that none would be in need. The Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 17 and 19, a much later picture of the church than the book of Acts. So we're reading probably in close to 60 A.D. Paul commands those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Paul writes Timothy, "Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life." The treasure we are to accumulate is a heavenly treasure, not an earthly treasure. Those are where the blessings, the true lasting blessings, reside. And so Jesus says, "Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him God the Father has placed his seal of approval." The crowd which followed Jesus from the feeding of the 5,000 asked him, "Well, then what must we do to do the work which God requires?" And Jesus answers, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." Now, in our next session, we're going to see just what that means and why, when confronted with that truth, many stopped following Jesus altogether. But that's for next time, and we'll see you then. In the meantime, let's be sure to keep our motivation straight to worship and to serve God for who God is, and not just for what we can get out of it. See you next.